And part 4 is going to be the denial of your antecedent. So, there's 4 parts to this, right? The affirmation of your antecedent, here. The affirmation of your consequence, here. The denial of your consequence. The denial of your consequence. The denial of your consequence, here. And then finally, the denial of the antecedent. The denial of the antecedent, here. It's important to know what the parts are, because irrespective of what points you are discussing, it doesn't matter what points you're discussing. It could be water conservation, it could be anything at all. You just need to know what's the antecedent and what's the consequence. And once you know what the antecedent and the consequence is, you can appropriate, if you want to use modus tollens, you can appropriate modus tollens to the construction of an argument once you recognize what each part does. Affirm, affirm, deny, deny. Okay. Now it's time to begin our actual argument. Right, we're going to add this, so I can erase all of this. Okay, so all of that was so that you understand each of the parts, you understand what each of the parts say, you understand what each of the parts mean, and insofar as you understand what they say and they mean, now you just have to use, now it's easy, right? Now you just start writing. You start writing. This is where, after all of that work, right, this is where you actually start to write your sentence. So I can see why people don't use logic to write their essays, because it makes writing essays that much more difficult, right? Because you really do need to do all of this preparatory work prior to even writing your first sentence. The thing is if you choose to write like this, it's going to be really difficult for objectors to identify weaknesses in your argument. And since, consistency and logic and rationality basically rules the world, well, you can follow the implication yourself. So example number 1. Okay, so insert step 3 from above. Step 3 is at the top, right? This is the first line. If water is conserved, then water is stored in the water table. So insert step 3 from above. Line 1, the antecedent, the affirmation of the antecedent. So we have, this is example number 1. Remember, exactly the same format we did before. Start with a sentence, example number 1, expand and augment that sentence, keeping the original sentence embedded within the new sentence, which is example number 2, and then example number 3 expands it even further. Same format as last section. So, we insert step 3, which is, so insert which gives us the antecedent, right? And that is what? What is that? It's if water is conserved, right? This concludes our antecedent. Now you should be able to see it in your mind, right? You should be able to see if water is conserved. As soon as I see the word then, as soon as I see that comma, I know I've transitioned. That's the line of demarcation, that comma. That word then is the line of demarcation between the antecedent and the consequence. So, if water is conserved, then water, right? So we know that this is A, and we know that this is B. If water is conserved, then water is stored in the water table. If water is conserved, then water is stored in the water table. We remember modus tollens. I said it before. I think parts are an easier way to remember it than maybe just the logic when you're first starting, right? It's affirmation, affirmation, denial, denial. Affirmation, affirmation, denial, denial. Affirmation, affirmation, denial, denial. If this happens, then this happens. Affirmation, affirmation, 2 parts. Denial, denial. This doesn't happen, this doesn't happen. This doesn't happen, this doesn't happen, right? Antecedent, our consequence doesn't happen, our antecedent doesn't happen, right? So if water is conserved, then water is stored in the water table. I use the word however, right? Technically you can use it as a conjunction, but we're going to use, I mean, linguistically, you need linguistically, we're not necessarily looking at this in terms of logic, but linguistically, however, lets the reader know, but there's something different that happens, right? If these things happen, it would have happened, you know, this thing would have been expected. However, that thing didn't happen. However, you might choose a different transition word, it doesn't really matter. However, where am I at? However, so I wrote, good transition word, however, coupled with the word less, functions as the denial, right? And now the actual denial of the consequence. The consequence here, B, we know the B is the consequence, if then, so just so that you see the logic. Ooh, actually I like that, right? Let's do this, because that looks cool. So that you can see the logic embedded in the argument, right? Here's A, this is the line of demarcation by the comma. There's an invisible arrow, and this is B. So we still have it, right? It's embedded here. So if A, then B. If water is conserved, then water is stored in the water table. However, we're going to deny this now, not B. However, there is less water in the water table. That's just the way I phrased it. You could have stayed consistent and say, however, water is not stored in the water table. Again, intuitively, we might say this differently. However, water, however, there is less water in the water. However, there is less water in the water table, right? However, right, water table is B, less is negation, so this sentence is not B. If A, then B, not B, therefore we know we need not A, right? We need to, part 4 is the denial of the antecedent. So our antecedent is here. We say that if water is conserved, so we know that water can't be conserved, right? So the conclusion has to be the denial of the antecedent, which is thus. You might choose therefore, it doesn't really matter, since, whatever. Thus, water conservation, this is just the way I chose to write it. You could obviously select different words. Thus, water conservation efforts, I just wanted to spice it up a little bit, you know what I'm saying, make it sound fancy. Thus, water conservation efforts have failed. Just to show you the flexibility. It doesn't have to be this robot language, right? This is basically preserving the idea. It's a perfect example, and this is why the comment with respect, you know, you might not think that there's a connection between this and the Rubik's Cube inverse orientation solve. It's not about it being perfect. It's about the fact that it's being done. That's the point, right? So the idea is, you don't want it to be verbatim exactly the same, because your writing is going to sound like freaking robot talk. Right? And I do like robot talk, but I mean, you know, there has to be some finesse to this, right? There has to be some give and take. So maintain the general tone and format, but you know, it has to be intelligible. So thus water conservation efforts have failed. Obviously the failed bit relates to the negation of the antecedent, right? So this is technically therefore not A. Right? So this is the argument, and here's where it's embedded. The red is the embedded logic in the argument. So here's where the logic is embedded in the argument. It's really invisible for all practical purposes unless you're an instructor like me and you can see it. And now I'm making it very, very observable for you. So let's just read it, and then I'll pause here because we're at the hour mark, right? So if water, this is the product of all of that work. After 1 hour of solid lecture, we finally get the fruits of our labor, which was a freaking sentence, like a few sentences. We worked really, really hard for this little bit, right? What's going to be amazing is that when this is all done, it's going to be awesome. But we really did labor quite a bit for this, just simple sentence, right? If water is conserved, then water is stored in the water table. However, there is less water in the water table. Thus, water conservation efforts have failed. It's not a bad sentence, right? It's a few sentences, maybe paragraph, right? Let me just read that one more time because it does have a nice little tone to it. More important than the tone, we know it sounds good, it reads well, but embedded in this is logic. We started, again, with the logic. When I was constructing this lecture series, I didn't know the sentence that I would get. I allowed the logic to help me derive the sentence. I had no idea of, obviously, what the sentence was going to be. I knew the logic, and the logic helped build the sentence. That's the point. Here's where the logic in the red is embedded invisibly. So when you read the book, you read the chapter, you won't see the logic, but I see the logic, and now I'm training you to see the logic, right? So that you can see it in the argument. Obviously, this is very, very simple logic. Once you start talking about other things, it gets a lot more complicated, but I won't be doing that series maybe ever, at least for a while. So, if water is conserved, then water is stored in the water table. However, there is less water in the water table, thus water conservation efforts have failed. Okay, I'm going to pause at this point now and then continue my lecture series in this same section, section 2, but it'll give me time to change my batteries out. I hope so far this is making sense. I hope this is meaningful because I'm now recognizing that I just spent a very long hour to construct a rather simple sentence or a series of sentences. So I'm going to pause right now and then I'll come back in a bit.